Hi everybody, welcome back to English 221. This is our class for Monday, the 28th, where we are transitioning from our first comedy, A Midsummer Night's Dream, to our second comedy, Much Ado About Nothing. And as you know, we have a journal due for Midsummer Night's Dream. That would be on the 28th today at 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. Be very similar to what you did with the first journal, albeit your first journal was about the sonnets. This journal will be focused on A Midsummer Night's Dream. Again, I'm anticipating about a page or so of response, but as long or as short as you'd like it to be, obviously you can do quite a bit of analysis with Midsummer. And I'm not evaluating for grammar or mechanics, just for content and giving a checkmark grade on it. And the idea behind the journal is that I will return that to you, and that might help you formulate some ideas for a more formal writing assignment, which would be due later on in the semester, our first paper, which is what I wanted to talk about today. So that gives you a little bit of time to catch up with Much Ado About Nothing. Hopefully you've already begun reading the play, and you can see that we've got 2 weeks devoted to that particular play, much like we did with Midsummer. Again, we will be watching performance as well as discussing content of the play itself. And eventually you will have a journal due for Much Ado About Nothing. And it'll be very similar to what you did with your journal with Midsummer. And I will return that to you, and that might help you with your first writing assignment, which is your first formal writing assignment, paper number 1, which is going to be a paper about the comedies, which is how we began our semester. That said, there is a possibility that you could write on the sonnets, which is really the very beginning of our semester. But that said, writing about a sonnet or a poem is very different than writing about a drama. So if you did elect to do something like that, you would want to touch base with me and give me a sense as to how you wanted to proceed. But I thought today I could talk about some possible paper topics, and I could also talk about some techniques for writing papers, although I'm fairly certain that you would have talked about this in previous English classes. So I'm very hopeful that this is review for you. Keep in mind that everybody has the option of rewriting the first paper, which I will evaluate both for grammar, mechanics, as well as content, and this time put a letter grade on it. And if you're satisfied with your grade, then you've completed the assignment. But if you wanted to earn a higher grade, you could incorporate my comments into a revision. And if you still weren't sure how to proceed with the revision, you could always meet with me, and then I could give you further suggestions. And I just ask that you hand in the original copy with your comment, or with my comments, along with your revisions, so that I can compare and contrast the two. And you would get the higher of the 2 grades. And you have until the ending of the semester in which to do so, but obviously the sooner the better for everybody involved. And eventually, at the ending of the semester, you would have a second paper, and that would be basically on the following plays that we would be studying after comedies. And that paper is going to be due so close to the ending of the semester that there really wouldn't be time to revise that paper. But the assumption is that you would have learned what you needed to learn about writing a paper in the first paper, so that you could just duplicate those skills in the second paper. That said, I have had individuals who've handed in the second paper early, and early enough so that they could do a revision. You would need to convince me that that would be something that would be of use to you, a revision. But certainly you don't need to do that with the first paper. Everybody has that particular option. And the first paper is not due for a while. It's not due until the 30th of March. But I want to start talking about it now, because early papers are always encouraged. And certainly you want to start to think about ideas for your paper. It's one of the things that I'm going to be talking about in terms of writing papers. What most students do is that they don't spend enough time trying to come up with ideas or to conceptualize how they're going to put together the paper. Instead, what they try to do is write the perfect first sentence, and they suffer as a result of it. Not only does the writing suffer, but usually what ends up happening is that they're not using their time efficiently and effectively, and that also shows in the writing. So if you will notice in the folder above on our Moodle site, we have syllabus and other documents. And what I've included in that area is a suggested paper topic list that would work for both paper number 1 and paper number 2 that I wanted to review with you, as well as a handout entitled The Critical Paper, which was actually distributed to me when I was an undergraduate student from my Shakespeare professor, who is known on campus as the God of Shakespeare. And I have yet to find something that's better, so I will be sharing that with you. But first, in terms of the paper topics for English 221, and again, you can find the hard copy of this in the syllabus and other documents folder, but I wanted to read this to you. That both paper number 1 and paper number 2 are critical papers. In other words, you're not expected to consult outside resources and to write a research paper. That said, if you do want to write a research paper, consult with me because I try to be flexible. Just note that writing a research paper is actually a more complex assignment because not only are you incorporating the ideas of others, but you still have to have your own original ideas. So at this point, the critical paper is basically based on your own interpretation and your own learning from this particular class. The paper length, approximately 4 to 5 pages. That would be double-spaced 1-inch margins, which is pretty standard for writing a paper. And those guidelines are also on our syllabus as well. But ultimately, those are just approximations, 4 to 5 pages. The paper should be as long as it needs to be in order to be able to defend your particular position. And what I've done is I've identified general topics that you might want to pursue for a paper, or you can write on your own topic. And note that the following are only suggestions, so feel free to adapt, combine, or dismiss. And if you choose to write on your own topic, it makes sense for you to briefly discuss the topic with me. In fact, it always makes sense to discuss how things are going with your paper with me ahead of time. We are using the MLA, or the Modern Language Association System, for parenthetical documentation when quoting from a text. The MLA is what's used in the humanities, which also includes languages such as English. And I'm hopeful this is something that you would have talked about in a previous class, but we will also be talking about it as well in a few moments, where basically at the ending of a quote, you use parentheses to indicate the location of that quote. The good news is that with Shakespeare, it's actually simpler because usually when you use parenthetical documentation, you need to reference something like the page number, or perhaps the author's surname and the page number, or perhaps even part of the title and the author's surname and the page number, or at least a partial website or based on the source that you happen to be using. But Shakespeare is fairly universal in that his plays are divided up into act, scene, and line. So regardless of the Shakespearean play, or regardless of the version of the Shakespearean play that you are using, we can always refer to act, scene, and line, much like I've done with our classes. And that would direct us to that particular location. So that's what we would be citing inside of our parentheses, the act, the scene, and the line, which I will talk about briefly in a few moments. And of course, the syllabus talks about paper formatting specifications, not only that a paper should be typed double-spaced with 1-inch margins, the pages should be numbered, and also there should be a cover page. And the cover page should basically list some general pieces of information, such as the paper title, which means the paper needs a title, your name, my name, the due date, the class number, the paper number. Most of that information is usually at the bottom right-hand corner, while the paper title is usually centered on the page. But again, it doesn't necessarily matter how you format that as far as I'm concerned. But I would like a cover page. And ultimately, what you want to do as well is to make sure that you've got a title that gives the audience an idea of what it is you are going to be discussing, which again, I will talk about in a few moments. And the cover page is not numbered. So I understand that you are writing things electronically, so I know that that might make things a little bit different in terms of handing in a paper, but since usually I ask for cover pages on papers, even though this is an electronic situation, I'm going to ask for a cover page for this paper. And our first paper would be addressing the comedies, either Midsummer Night's Dream and or Much Ado About Nothing. Although, again, the sonnets are a possibility, depending, of course, on what topic you would be pursuing. Paper number 2, which would be towards the ending of the semester, would either address the next genre of play that we would be reading after comedies. That happens to be history, Richard II, or tragedies, Macbeth and Othello. And that said, we will end the semester with an extra credit play called The Tempest, which is a tragic comedy. And that too might be a possibility for paper number 2, but understand that we wouldn't have had the time to discuss it in class in the way that we would discuss the tragedies or the history. So one of the things you can consider in terms of writing a paper is thinking about imagery, which we've already talked about in terms of Shakespeare, to isolate a central or particularly meaningful image or symbol in Shakespeare's play and examine that in more depth. Something like light and dark imagery, or animal imagery, or food imagery, for instance, and discuss one of the plays in terms of that image and what it discloses. Another way you could proceed is thinking about character, examining one of the characters or perhaps several of the characters, but definitely you don't want to examine too much so that you can't do a thorough job in 4 to 5 pages. So perhaps examining one of the characters in one of the plays and his or her contribution to the play as a whole. Or you can examine a theme, a central idea that's found in one of the plays. Analyze a major theme in one of the plays, such as revenge or suspicion or trust or death or love or power or justice. Or perhaps you might be interested in doing a compare and contrast, where you can compare and contrast, let's say, 2 characters or 2 themes. Now, these don't necessarily have to be from the same play, but I would not have a paper that is as broad as comparing and contrasting 2 different plays, because that would probably require a book of analysis, not 4 to 5 pages. But it would be interesting to, let's say, compare and contrast something like an Oberon in A Midsummer Night's Dream and a Don John in Much Ado About Nothing. So that definitely limits things a bit. Or gender, to analyze one or perhaps 2 of the plays in terms of gender and power relationships, which is something that we talked about very much with Midsummer. How does Shakespeare present the relationships between, and notice all the possible combinations, women and men, women and women, and or men and men in the world of the play? Within underneath that, under the asterisks, a good question to ask yourself when you're writing a paper or when you're reading somebody else's writing is, quote, have I or has the author said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible, unquote. And you can see immediately after that in parenthetical documentation, it's the author's surname and then the page number. Close your parentheses and then your ending punctuation for the sentence, or you would continue on with the sentence if necessary. But this is a pretty tall order to say things clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible, which is why I wanted to transition to the second handout that I had posted in your syllabus and other documents folder, and that's about the critical paper and some of the structure for writing a paper. And notice that it's divided up into 3 elements, the first being planning, the second being writing, the third being editing and presentation. And I can tell you that most students will skip the planning stage and go directly to the writing stage, trying to write the perfect first sentence, become quite frustrated, and then put the writing aside until the last possible moment, and then just do something very hurriedly. And I encourage you not to do that. That you spend some time, which is why I'm talking about this now, contemplating ideas. You don't have to write anything down, and if you do write something down, you don't need to worry about grammar or mechanics or spelling. Again, this is just a way for you to generate ideas. And remember that you are analyzing, not summarizing. So you're not doing what I call the junior high school book report, proving that you understood the plot. We're moving beyond plot, and we're starting to talk about analysis, not what happened, but why those things happen. Assume the reader has some familiarity with the text, so basically what you're doing is you're interpreting. So you don't need to retell the entire story, just retell those elements that are necessary for your particular argument. Or a fancy way of saying this is confine your comments on plot to subordinate clauses, the least important portions of your sentences, emphasizing the main clause, the significance of that action. So you've probably heard the word thesis. It's something that we usually talk about in English classes. A thesis is a position that reasonable people could disagree about. In other words, it implies some sort of interpretive conclusion that you are drawing. And usually we put the thesis in the opening paragraph. This can be a little bit tricky, however, because you may not know what your thesis is until you're done writing. But there's no reason why you have to write your paper in chronological order. One suggestion I give to students is to write their paper, not necessarily worried about the introductory paragraph, and then when they're done writing it, reread it to themselves and summarize in a sentence or two what the main point is of what they've said. And then they could put that into an opening paragraph. That would be that 1 or 2 sentences, your thesis or your main point. And keep in mind that your thesis might change as you're writing, because part of writing is the discovery of a thesis. And you want to have an argument that's comprehensive enough to be important, not something that's so general or bland that's meaningless. And the example that we're given is, in Hamlet, Shakespeare explores the complexities of experience. In Hamlet, Shakespeare explores the complexities of experience. The problem is, this is true of every author and every text. So it's so general, it says nothing at all. Or saying something like, Shakespeare employs much imagery in Hamlet. Shakespeare employs much imagery in Hamlet is also not very useful, because most authors employ imagery. The question is, what imagery is employed and why is it important? That would be part of your thesis. So what you need to do is, after your introductory paragraph where you've listed the name of the author, the name of the text, your thesis, you need to have body paragraphs, and each of those body paragraphs supply the evidence or the support for your particular position. You're much like a courtroom attorney, where basically what you're doing is you are gathering those pieces of evidence that will help you with your presentation. A good attorney can argue either side of the case, just like you should be able to argue multiple sides that oftentimes are in direct contradiction to one another about a particular text, and all should be done equally well, though I understand that sometimes there's more evidence on one side than another. But of course, someone who's skilled can take the pieces of evidence that exist and use those in a way that would help support their particular position. So my job in reading a paper is basically to take the opposite position. So whatever it is that you're going to say, I'm going to say the opposite. So if you wanted to argue that love is blind in A Midsummer Night's Dream, I'll say no, it's not, even though that's ridiculous. The idea is that you prove that love is blind in Midsummer Night's Dream by giving examples from the text. Whether you do it through paraphrase, writing it in your own language, or direct quotation, word for word, probably a combination of the two. And keep in mind, as is indicated in the planning stage, that paragraphs usually begin with something called the topic sentence. So if the paragraph is well written, there's usually a sentence known as the topic sentence that begins the paragraph that basically summarizes what the paragraph is about. So if you've got a piece of strong writing, what you should be able to do is just to read the first sentences of your entire paper and get a good skeletal outline to what it is that your argument is about. Again, you have to support your argument with analysis and reference to the text and some direct quotation where appropriate. And you want to avoid extremes. You don't want to just add in quotation because you're trying to get length. Length should come from multiple arguments, not necessarily from padding the paper with unnecessary quotation or with a lot of repetition or redundancy in your language. And you also want to avoid having a paper with no quotation, because the quotation will be part of your support. Generally speaking, you want to avoid ending a paragraph with a quote, because usually you comment on the relevance of that particular quote. However, notice I said generally speaking. There are always situations that defy the rules. You just need to understand what's appropriate. I kind of liken it to driving, and that we all have to follow some basic rules, just like we all have to follow some basic rules with writing. But of course, we all drive differently, and we all adapt based on things like the vehicle we're driving and the environment and our personal situation. And it's the same with writing, that sometimes you can bend the rules depending on the situation. You need to have a concluding paragraph, and that concluding paragraph is going to probably be challenging to write because you've already said everything, and quite frankly, you are tired at this point in the exercise. So you want to save a little bit of extra energy, almost like running a marathon, for the end. You don't want to just recopy your introduction, and one of the things you could do is perhaps hint at a related work, or perhaps, this almost always works, is talk about your topic in relation to contemporary times. And Keep in mind that a paragraph is a minimum of 3 sentences. It has an intro, a body, and a conclusion, much like a paper has an intro, body, and conclusion. So anything less than 3 sentences is not a paragraph, and that includes your concluding paragraph when, again, you've probably run out of a lot of energy and a lot of interest. So you want to make sure that's as well developed as anything else. So now the second piece is the writing piece. Once you've got ideas fleshed out, then you can think about how to improve the writing. I had a very wise professor in college who once said that a piece of writing is never done. You just have to hand it in at some point. And I think that's quite true, that you can continue to refine and polish, but we just don't have that kind of time. So based on the time that you do have, how can you improve the structure of your sentences? And I can't emphasize this enough. The first principle of good writing is economy, and the second is simplicity. Say as much as possible in as few words as possible. In other words, try to be concise in your writing. I can tell you right now, this is my biggest challenge myself as an author. So even English teachers have their own challenges with writing. The idea is that you should be able to look at each sentence individually and ask yourself, can I rephrase this sentence in fewer words and not sacrifice meaning? And if so, then you should probably do so. I understand this can be a painful exercise because now you're beginning to lose length in your paper. But again, length should come from argument, not from unnecessary language. Better to have a shorter paper that's well written than to have a longer paper that's not well written. And I can tell you that many of my comments are about deleting things, not necessarily adding things to papers. So, good writing depends on strong verbs and nouns, verbs being actions, nouns being persons, places, things, or ideas. Adjectives and adverbs, descriptive words, can be very helpful, but you don't want to overuse them purely to add length. And prefer the active to the passive voice. In other words, you want to clearly show that the subject of the sentence is performing the action, not that the action is occurring to the subject of the sentence. So think about the difference between something like Lillian graded the papers. This is the active voice where the subject of the sentence, Lillian, is engaged in the action of the sentence, which is grading. As opposed to the other way around, the papers were graded by Lillian as if the action were happening to the subject of the sentence. The grading was happening to Lillian. But I always talk about the active to the passive voice in terms of being concise, that the active voice is usually more concise. Just think about a simple count of the number of words in each sentences, and each of the sentences that I suggested. Lillian graded the papers is 4 words. The papers were graded by Lillian is 6 words. And of course, the rule of thumb is that if you can say something in fewer words and not sacrifice meaning, you should. So regardless of how you want to think about it, whether it's active as opposed to passive or writing concisely, the idea is that you're reviewing your sentences to see ways that you can improve what you're saying, as well as ultimately trying to avoid sentence level errors. Things like run-ons, running together 2 or more sentences with no punctuation, or comma splice, running together 2 or more sentences with only a comma without a conjunction or a connecting word. Words like but, or, yet, so, for, and nor. Or perhaps you have a fragment, an incomplete sentence, which oftentimes occurs because what is missing from that sentence occurs in the previous or the following sentence. So it makes sense when you read it as a whole. But of course, you should read each sentence as an independent unit and ask yourself, does this make sense as an independent unit? You want to vary your sentences so that you are having a mix of long and short sentences. Too many long sentences, your writing sounds dense. Too many short sentences, your writing sounds choppy. And you also want to vary your sentence beginnings, especially with sentences that appear next to one another. So you wouldn't want to have multiple sentences, let's say, all beginning with the same word, such as 3 sentences in a row beginning with the word Hermia, for instance. A paragraph, as I indicated, is a developed idea, so no 1 or 2 sentence paragraphs, although you do see that in journalism, but that's a different kind of writing than the writing in academia, which is also the writing of business. So that's how you translate the writing that we have to the workplace. Random notes, avoid things like cliches. These are overused expressions, which actually, in many respects, were created by Shakespeare. I think I pointed to a few in Midsummer Night's Dream, such as the course of true love never did run true, or what we will find in Othello, jealousy is that green-eyed monster. but they were original at the time in which Shakespeare wrote them. In other words, the layperson is quoting from Shakespeare all the time and they don't even realize it. But now it's considered to be an overused expression that doesn't have any kind of originality. Think about how difficult it would be to explain some of these expressions. Think about something like raining cats and dogs. What do dogs and cats have to do with rain? And again, when we say the expression, we place cats before dogs, not dogs before cats. There really is no rhyme or reason for that. A rhyme or reason is also Shakespeare. But that said, think about if English was your second or your third or your fourth language and the difficulty of trying to understand this particular expression. The same with slang. Slang is informal language that we want to try to avoid in our writing. Slang is usually language that is created by a particular group of individuals, oftentimes to exclude other individuals from understanding the meaning. In other words, what adolescents do every generation, they create slang so that the adults don't understand. Sometimes slang can go mainstream, so it seems that everybody is using that particular piece of slang. But again, think about somebody who's learning English as a second or a third or a fourth language and how difficult it would be to understand that cool is related to temperature, but it can also mean somebody that has an interesting personality when we say someone is a cool person. And that hot is also related to temperature, but that could also be related to someone's physical appearance. And I always give a real life story to emphasize this particular point. I try to give humorous stories, but warning, this is not a humorous story, although it is a real story that occurred several decades ago. And it was all over the news, in which a second language student was going to a Halloween, or it might have been a Halloween party, but it was definitely a party. And he ended up going to the wrong home, a home that had been burglarized several times previously. Let's just say the owner of the home was skittish. At any rate, student knocks on the door, owner opens the door, student asks, is this where the party is? And the owner answers with a slang term that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, freeze, which means to stop, to halt. But the student, for whatever reason, misheard, misunderstood, took a step forward. The owner's response was to pull out the gun that he always wore and to shoot it off and kill the student on his doorstep, all because of a misunderstanding. And it completely changed the way languages were taught in classrooms. That yes, you need to know the academic version of language, but you also need to know the language of the streets, so to speak, because we speak differently than we write. And that said, yeah, I think it's a great illustration about the reason why it isn't just merely some pet peeve why English teachers say to avoid things like cliches or trite expressions. It's because there's just a greater chance of being misunderstood. So we want to have some universality as much as possible, some standardization, some agreement about what is acceptable or not acceptable in written language so that there isn't a greater possibility of misunderstanding. Also, the idea of maintaining the present tense, I know, is going to probably seem very unfamiliar with you, and that when we talk about literature, we talk about in the present, in the now, as opposed to the past, even though it was written in the past, even though you read it in the past. So it's not that Hermia said to Helena, it's that Hermia says to Helena. And if you find this difficult to do, what I suggest you do is that when you proofread, you look very carefully for all of the times that you would have used the past tense and just simply change it to the present tense. The last piece for you is the presentation, where you want to make sure that you're proofreading. Again, many students, because they write at the last minute, run out of time and they're not able to do this piece. And I encourage you to try to finish early enough so that you could put your writing away for 24, 48 hours and then come to it with a fresh eye. But even if you can only put it away for a few minutes, the idea is to try to look at it from a fresh perspective so that you can find errors within it. If you have difficulty proofreading, one suggestion is to read backwards, that you read from page 4 and you work your way to page 1, so that, yes, the argument does not make sense, so that you can concentrate on the structure of the sentences themselves and possible errors within the sentences. I always recommend that you show your writing to other people. The Gcc Tutoring Center is a wonderful resource because not only is it free in that you don't have to pay additional dollars, this is embedded within your tuition dollars, but the tutors are basically former students who have a skill in that particular subject area. And this is a job for them, and they are paid for this through the college. So they aren't giving you any favors in this perspective. And it's a wonderful way to get feedback from an outsider's view, somebody who has some understanding of writing, in order to be able to get a sense as to what your writing is like. Keep in mind that I had included on our website that we've got a chat as well as a discussion forum. That could be another way that you could try out ideas and have other eyes look on them or look at them. And I always recommend that you read your paper out loud as well, because oftentimes you can hear errors that might not be obvious. I liken it to listening to a piece of music. You may not be able to read music, but you might be able to identify when the wrong note is hit, and may not even be able to articulate why that note is wrong, but you just know that it's wrong and you know when it sounds correct. That really is enough with writing, unless you're going to be an English teacher. You really don't necessarily need to have the language to explain the error and the language to correct the error. You just need to be able to find the error and then actually correct it, or perhaps avoid the error in the first place. Again, you should have a title, and your title should be original to your paper. So you do not want to name your paper the same title as the author who wrote the particular text. So you don't want to call your paper Much Ado About Nothing, because that title has already been taken by Shakespeare. However, you can embed that title within your own title. So you could say something like Love Relationships in Much Ado About Nothing. And that would be an original title, because Shakespeare never wrote love relationships in Much Ado About Nothing. He merely wrote Much Ado About Nothing. Now, usually when we are referring to a text that's been published, there is a way that we can indicate whether that text is a longer text, something like a drama or a novel, or it's a shorter text, something like a short story or a poem. And again, this is just for published works. This does not include your works, which have not been published. So if you are referring to a longer text, such as a Shakespearean drama, we either put it in italics or we underline it. If you are referring to a shorter text, such as, let's say, a Shakespearean sonnet, well, then you put the title, or as we know for a sonnet, we refer to the first line as its title, in quotation marks. So that gives the reader a sense a little bit about the kind of text that they happen to be reading. You don't have to underline your own title, put it in bold, quotation marks, larger font, or anything like that. Again, identify the author and the work someplace in the first paragraph. And to give you an idea of the age of this particular handout that I'm reviewing with you, it says instructors prefer typewritten papers. And of course, that's nonsense in 2022. You must type your paper. And it should be double-spaced 1-inch margins with the title page. And you don't need to submit a bulky folder or plastic cover if you are handing in, obviously, a paper version. And if you were handing in a paper version, you would use a staple. But obviously, that's not going to be applicable, because you will be submitting it online via PDF to my email, ruers@gcc.mass.edu. And the paper's due, which is obvious, on the date assigned. If you need additional time, just ask me for an extension. I'll be happy to grant it for you. That said, I am hopeful that by the time that this paper is due, that you would be comfortable with handing in a paper, because by that point, we would be more than halfway through the semester, believe it or not. Time flies. And I wanted us to have enough time to be able to think about our second paper as much as we're thinking about the first paper. So I'm starting you thinking about the first paper now at the ending of February, since we spent the first part of the semester talking about or with an orientation to Shakespeare in his time, and talking a little bit about his sonnets, and now we've just gotten into the actual construction of his dramas themselves. And as I had indicated, in terms of quotation, that what you would put at the ending of a quote in parentheses is the act, the scene, and the line, which I will be including in our class notes next class, so that you can see what that actually looks like. The idea behind that is that it makes it much more universal in terms of being able to find Shakespearean quotation. The other rules of quotation are fairly similar, that you use quotation marks before and after. At the beginning of where you decide to start your quote, you can start at any point. And then right after the ending of where you've ended your quote, you can end at any point. You don't necessarily need to start at the beginning of a sentence or end at the ending of a sentence. And that if you were going to leave out part of a quote from the point where you decided to begin, from the point to where you decided to end, not before the quote or after the quote, because there's an assumption there's text after that, but between that first point of where you've begun your quote, point A, and the last point where you've begun your quote, or where you've ended your quote, point B. If you're going to leave something out, you use an ellipsis, which is 3 periods in a row, which shows that there is an omission in that quote. And if you're going to add something into a quote from point A to point B, from where you've started it and ended it, you're going to insert your own voice. You're doing so merely to clarify, not to give commentary, because you can always give commentary immediately before or after the quote. It would be very comparable to interrupting somebody when they're speaking, that you try not to do that unless that's absolutely necessary. And what you would do is use square brackets. And within those square brackets, any language that you put within those square brackets, you're indicating to the reader that was not part of the original quote. That was yours. And lastly, if you have a long quote, which is usually defined as over 3 lines long, then you use block quotation formatting. That what you do is that you indent that quote so that it appears as a block, so that it's very clear to the reader that that is a quote. And because it is clear through the formatting that it's a quote, you don't need to use quotation marks, because quotation marks are merely used to indicate that you have a quote, but that's already clear based on the way that you have formatted it. I've seen block quotation done in a lot of ways, either centered on the page, or perhaps it could be all the way to the left or all the way to the right. I personally like centered in a single space, but ultimately you've got a lot of options there. The only difference is that the ending punctuation in a block quote comes before the parenthetical documentation, not after the parenthetical documentation, the way that you would do if you were actually quoting in the text of your paper. So again, I'll give some information so that you can visualize, so that you can read and see what these elements look like when you are quoting. But again, I'm assuming that this is review for you. At least I'm hopeful that this is review for you. Outside of the idea that this time we don't have to reference something like page number, we can reference act, scene, and line. So, as I indicated, you should be in the midst of reading Much Ado About Nothing. Next class, we'll talk a little bit more about the play, and I wanted to talk about production as well. For today's attendance question, I thought I would ask you about paper number 1, because ultimately this class was devoted to paper number 1. Then in terms of your experiences with writing papers and your experience in this class, what do you think the most challenging thing will be for you in terms of writing your first paper, and why? What do you think would be the most challenging thing for you writing the first paper, and why? And again, you can answer this on the discussion forum, and this will be due by Wednesday at 8 a.m. And while you're not required to respond to your peers, I do encourage you to read your peer responses so that you can get an idea of what we would have talked about in class. And I will be responding to everyone's individual response, so you'll get that feedback as well. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about Much Ado About Nothing. Take care. Bye-bye.